Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for joining us for this conference, both in person and online as well. So I'm going to try to build a little bit, if I can, on what we've already heard this morning about some of the challenges of our current food system and the transformations that are required in terms of both how we produce and consume food, and in doing that to look at some of the findings from a review that we recently published on this area. Okay, so we've already seen this definition this morning, so I won't discuss it in too much detail, but just to reiterate that there are many different factors that we need to consider when we talk about a diet that is truly healthier and more sustainable. It's not just about the environment and nutrition, but what's affordable, what is accessible, what is culturally acceptable as well. However, while definitions such as this are useful as a starting point, the obvious question is how can we put this into practice? And there is, of course, a lot of debate around exactly what a healthier and more sustainable diet should and should not contain. And so that led us on to conducting a review of the recent literature in this area, including 29 studies from high-income countries such as the UK, to try to get a handle on what the main features are of a healthier and more sustainable diet. And within this, we looked at studies that considered the whole diet, so not just changes to individual food groups in isolation, that included at least one metric on the environment, as well as some sort of measure of the dietary quality or the nutritional content of the diet. And I think importantly, we tried to consider a balance in terms of a range of different approaches to what is a very complex problem to approach. The aim being to try to identify the main synergies, but also the differences and trade-offs that need to be considered. And so overall, across the almost 30 different studies that we looked at that approach this problem in slightly different ways, generally speaking, compared to our current diets, eating more plant-derived foods such as fruits, vegetables, beans, pulses, nuts, seeds, and possibly some plant-based meat alternatives as well also is likely to decrease the greenhouse gas emissions and the land use associated with our current diets, as well as having health benefits. When it came to meat, we found that moderate meat consumption was still an important part of a healthier and more sustainable diet, and this may be due to the important micronutrients such as iron, for example, in a bioavailable form that meat can provide. And when it came to dairy foods and eggs, the findings were less consistent, and this might be due to one of the trade-offs that we need to consider, for example, between the environment and nutrition, in that these foods are nutrient-dense and relative to their more intermediate environmental impact. And one important aspect of our diets currently that's often not considered in a lot of high-level global studies of sustainable diets is that of foods high in fat, salt, and sugar, or discretionary foods, if you like, as well as beverages, both alcoholic and non-alcoholic. And in some instances, we found, for example, in the Netherlands and Australia, that when these foods contribute quite a large amount in terms of the energy content of the current diet, perhaps not too surprisingly, they also contribute quite substantially to the environmental impact as well. And within the review, while we generally tried to avoid attaching specific numbers in terms of the impact reductions that we could achieve, more or less somewhere in the range of approximately 20 to 50% across those range of different methodologies and approaches appears to be possible in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and land use, but while respecting these different domains of not just nutrition and health, but also what's culturally acceptable and what is affordable. However, there are some important trade-offs that we need to consider, and one of these certainly is the water footprint of our diet. We found that it appears to be more difficult to achieve reductions in this area through dietary changes alone than for the other aspects of environmental impact. This may be due to the need for higher amounts of fruits and vegetables, and nuts possibly also, which are quite a water-intensive crop, in order to meet healthy diet recommendations. And I'd like to zero in a little bit on a particular aspect of the review, which was considering what's known as optimization studies. Now, this is a modelling technique that looks at what we are currently consuming and tries to model a theoretical diet that meets nutrient requirements while also reducing environmental impact, but with the least possible amount of change from what we are currently consuming. And across 52 different scenarios, you can see here on the right the general balance in terms of the number of these scenarios where particular food groups either increased versus the current diet, decreased, or where the changes were less obvious. And so you can see that, perhaps not too surprisingly, and with consistency to the previous slide, that these were generally plant-derived foods as well as things such as fish and seafood. And while things such as food groups like meat and beverages and foods high fat, salt, sugar decreased, that these were generally not excluded from the diet. But again, the changes were less consistent when we looked at things such as milk and yogurt and eggs. Now, an obvious question is, what about vegan diets? We have heard a lot, of course, consistently in the media around whether or not excluding animal-based products from our diet is the most sustainable solution. And we found that in the studies that we looked at, excluding animal-based foods could lead to large reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and land use, and also have potential health benefits. However, this may slightly increase the water footprint of our current diets, and it's unlikely that many people will adopt a strict vegetarian diet in the UK. Of course, we have a very rapidly growing interest in consuming a more plant-based diet and in vegan-friendly products, and there definitely does appear to be a trend over time in people reducing their meat intake. However, currently at the moment, only about 1% of people report strictly following a vegan diet and about 4% a vegetarian diet. And we also need to think about the potential nutritional implications if excluding animal-derived foods from the diet, particularly for some nutrients that are provided in a bioavailable form by animal-based foods, such as iron, zinc, iodine, and vitamins A and B12. Now, this could be a potential cause for concern for some groups where we already have evidence of low intakes or status in the UK. For example, 1 in 10 teenage girls aged 11 to 18 are considered to have iron deficiency and anemia. And so perhaps the most important question is, well, how can we eat a healthier and more sustainable diet? Now, as we have already heard and seen a lot about so far this morning, this is a very complex problem, and there is not likely to be any ideal one-size-fits-all solution to this. However, we did find, as an outcome of our review, that there are some actions that are likely to benefit our own health and that of the planet, and some general principles that we can follow to try to shift our diets in what seems a sensible direction of travel. And that is centred around these 6 areas, principally linked to increasing adherence to the existing dietary advice that we already have in the UK, which, as we saw earlier, is predicted to lower the environmental impact compared to what we currently eat. And so I'd like to unpack a little bit, if I may, each of these areas now and try to offer just a few examples of simple suggestions that we can try to work into our daily lives in order to make some positive changes. So firstly, around adhering more closely to the Eat Well guide, which is a plant-rich diet. Whilst it is not entirely plant-based, it is predominantly composed of foods that are from plant sources. And an analysis that was published last year estimated that if we adhered more closely to the Eat Well guide, this would have both environmental and health benefits, which you see there. And another potential advantage of the Eat Well guide, but also other food-based dietary guidelines that we have elsewhere in Europe as well as internationally, is that they do aim to be culturally familiar in the foods that they show and can, for example, with the Eat Well guide, include some nutrient-rich animal-derived foods in moderation. At the moment, about 30% of people achieve 5 out of the 9 recommendations in the analysis I just mentioned, so there is clear room for improvement. For example, only 0.1% managed to achieve all 9 of the recommendations. And within this, consuming more fruit, vegetables, whole grains and other plant-based foods would increase our fibre intakes, which would be a positive aspect in terms of gut health, but also, as we know, consuming more fibre is associated with a lower risk of several chronic diseases. But at the moment, in the UK context, only 1 in 5 children and fewer, 1 in 10 adolescents and adults, currently meet their age-specific fibre recommendations. So area number 2 is around eating more fruit and vegetables, which is something that we of course know is a cornerstone of a healthier diet, and aiming for at least 5 portions a day can have benefits in terms of reducing the risk of a number of chronic diseases, and also provide many important essential vitamins, minerals and fibre in the diet as well. And within this, variety is an important message because different types of fruits and vegetables provide these nutrients in different ways. However, only a third of adults and fewer than 1 in 8 adolescents at the moment are currently meeting their 5 a day. And here and over the next few slides, I have just a few simple tips or sort of suggestions, if you like, for how we could try to do this. It's important to stress that we need to think about different personal and cultural preferences when we're making recommendations. So these are just suggestions, but things such as swapping out snacks for something healthier, or finding ways to add fresh, frozen or canned vegetables to recipes, or even adding fruit to breakfast cereal in the morning is just a few suggestions for how we can try to work this into our routine. And the third area is around both expanding the choice but also shifting the balance of the protein source foods that we have in our diet. So rebalancing more in favour of protein sources that are from plants, including beans, pulses, nuts, seeds, but also alongside some moderate amounts of animal source foods as well. But it's important to stress it's not just about protein. We do need to think also about the overall nutrient composition of both animal-based and plant-based alternatives, particularly if we are shifting our diets in this direction, to consider some of the essential nutrients that I already mentioned that are provided in a readily absorbable form from animal-based foods. And again, a couple of suggestions for how we could do this. For adding beans or other pulses into dishes, things such as a curry or chili con carne, or maybe even for adding chickpeas as the base for a salad, or unsalted nuts or seeds as a snack. The fourth area is around limiting foods high in fat, salt and sugar, which we all know is another important aspect of a healthier diet, and trying to limit these foods to the occasional treat is something that is important because these are not the healthiest choices that we can make. But of course, as we already saw, these foods can contribute to the greenhouse gases, land and water use and other environmental impacts linked to our diets as well. So a few suggestions for how we could do this. Well, number 1, to be more portion-wise. Think more about when we consume these foods, the quantity that we have. And also, alongside this, trying to plan ahead and make healthier snack options more available for when we do want something to eat. So things such as lower sugar, higher fibre cereals with milk, things like wholemeal toast and peanut butter, or fat-free, no added sugar, yoghurt and berries. Now, the fifth area is around more sustainable fish and seafood. We know that fish, of course, provides an important source of long-chain omega-3 fats as well as vitamins and minerals, and that we have the recommendation to consume at least 2 portions, one of which should be an oily fish. But also, we have an issue in terms of global fish stocks. About a third are estimated to be overfished currently, and it's very important that we try to choose more sustainable sources. Number 1, in the UK context at least, is to try to experiment with a wider variety of seafood outside of what's called the Big Five. These species that you see here represent about an estimated 80% of the seafood we consume in the UK. And so trying to eat a broader range of species can place less pressure on these big five. You could do this through, for example, the Good Fish Guide, which offers more sustainable alternatives to these commonly consumed choices, as well as looking out for eco-labels on products such as the blue MSC logo and others that provide some assurances around the sustainability of how foods have been produced in terms of the environment, as well as animal welfare, but also other considerations such as the employment of people involved in producing these foods. And the last, and arguably the most important area, I think, is that of wasting less foods and drinks. Irrespective of the type of diet we choose, this is essential to us achieving a healthier and more sustainable diet. About a third of the food that we produce currently is either lost in the supply chain or wasted, and this accounts for about an estimated 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, according to IPCC. And as we already heard this morning, we have made very good progress in this area in the UK, and you can see some more figures there in the top right. However, awareness might be an issue. Less than a third of UK adults firmly recognise a link between wasting food and climate change. Now, this is something that RAP, for example, has been working to raise awareness of, and they had their inaugural Food Waste Action Week in 2021, earlier this year, to try to raise awareness of this issue. A few simple suggestions, although there are many more, for how we could try to reduce our food waste includes things such as using food labels better, so using the information on how we can store foods, best before dates versus use by dates, planning meals before we go shopping to make sure that we buy what we intend to for the meals that we want to have throughout the week. And also simple things such as setting our fridge to the correct temperature. The average fridge temperature in the UK is slightly above this range, and that can, of course, mean that foods go off more quickly. In the UK, there's an estimated 3 million glasses of milk that are poured down the sink every day for this reason. And so, before I come on to summarise, I'd just like to highlight a few of the recommendations that emerged from our review in terms of future research and policy. And number one, very importantly, is that nutrition really should be central to discussions around how we transform food systems and diets. Yes, we need to consider environmental impacts, but also we need to consider nutrition as a core function of our food system, alongside other factors such as affordability and acceptability. In order to do this, it appears we definitely need greater collaboration between researchers from different disciplines. And of course, we've heard about how that is beginning to happen now in terms of training future generations of more food system-minded researchers and food industry professionals. So collaboration between people from different disciplines such as health and environmental sciences, as well as economics and others, but also ensuring that the data that we have is representative. So is it locally relevant environmental data rather than global averages? And linked to that, does it reflect, as we saw earlier, does it reflect the nutritional quality and the nutrient contribution that foods make in the diet? So, for example, greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams of protein, or even per milligram or microgram of a particular nutrient. And ensuring that the local versus global impacts of our dietary choices as well are considered, so that we avoid unintended consequences. Again, we need to think about, as we shift our diets and, of course, our supply chains and systems of production, does that have an impact elsewhere? Do we simply outsource impacts, particularly from high-income countries, to other regions globally that are already suffering the effects of climate change, as well as things such as water scarcity more acutely? And lastly, we need more information on the barriers and motivators for people to change their diets and how these might differ based on personal or cultural preferences or things such as age. We all have different nutritional needs, of course, and we all have different ways that we may be motivated to change our diets. And so overall, healthier and more sustainable diets do need to consider the environmental impacts, yes, but alongside nutrition as a core aspect, and also things such as cost, affordability, acceptability, and other aspects such as the livelihoods of producers working in the food system. More sustainable dietary patterns are predominantly plant-based, but can also include more moderate amounts of animal-derived foods as well. And while vegan diets may have large environmental benefits, there are other things that we need to consider, such as the potential impact on nutrient intakes. While the research in this area is ongoing, we feel that increasing adherence to the Eat Well guide is a sensible direction of travel and is a familiar plant-rich dietary pattern that we can all aim to follow more closely. Although, of course, we see that there's room for improvement in terms of the number of adults that are currently meeting at least 5 out of 9 recommendations. And we can do this through action across the areas that you see at the bottom, increasing our intake of fruit and vegetables, sustainable fish, plant-based sources of protein, while limiting less healthy foods high in fat, salt and sugar, and very importantly, reducing the amount of food and drink that we waste. So thank you very much. We do have more information available on our website on this subject, and you can access the full findings from the review, which is open access on the link that you see at the bottom. Right, thank you.